I heard an old story, how the Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood's atoning, and I repented of my sin and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. I heard about his healing, of his cleansing power revealing, how he made the lame to walk again and caused the blind to see. And then I cried, dear Jesus, come and heal my broken spirit. And somehow Jesus came and brought to me the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. Beneath the cleansing flood, I heard about a mansion he's built for me in glory, and I heard about the streets of gold beyond the crystal sea, about the angels singing and the old redemption story. And some sweet day I'll sing up there the song of victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing blood.
Scripture reading is from Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 48. It is now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. Just then there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. As he went, the crowd pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhage for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately the hemorrhage left her. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." The word of God for the people of God.
Good morning. Just going to move this out of the way. Okay, so if I asked you this morning, who are you? I wonder what your response would be. I bet some of you are asking this very same question about me now. Who are you and where has Randy gone? This is a question that I have been asked many times over the past 7 weeks, and a question I have asked many of you. Each time my response has been somewhat similar. My name is Hannah. I'm the Duke Summer Ministry intern. I'm from England. I love coffee. And no, unfortunately, I don't know the Queen. Today is the first time I am preaching, and don't worry, yes, if it goes wrong or badly, I will be on a plane to England in a couple of weeks. All those facts that I have told you about me paint a picture, but do they really tell you who I am? Do they tell you of my true identity? In our gospel story today, Luke tells us of a woman whose whole identity was wrapped up in her isolation. A woman who's been defined by her bleeding for 12 years. We know from Mark's gospel that she has seen many doctors and she has spent all of her money and no one was able to heal her. Today we might feel slightly awkward talking about a woman on her period in church. It might seem like a strange passage to pick for my first ever sermon. But our awkwardness around this passage is nothing compared to the social taboo around periods for women in ancient Israel. Leviticus 15 gives us some insight into these laws. It reads, "When a woman has her regular flow of blood, anyone who touches her will be unclean." Thus, for the woman in our story, her identity was solely as the bleeding woman. If we asked her the question today of who are you, her response probably would have been pretty simple. It would have been unclean. This woman could not go to the synagogue, and she could not, under any circumstances, come into contact with human beings. For 12 whole years, she has not been able to go to the synagogue. For 12 years, she hasn't been able to come into contact with anyone. So for 12 years, her identity has been wrapped up in an isolation about impurity. An isolation so pertinent, we don't even get her name in this passage. It's really almost easy to overlook the story of this woman in this passage because there's a lot going on. So her story comes at a time when Jesus is on his way to do something really important. Jairus' daughter was dying. And if we asked Jairus the question, "Who are you?" his response would have been far different to the response of our bleeding woman. Jairus was an important man. Jairus was a leader in the synagogue. And Jairus was a faithful servant of God. And all of a sudden, Jairus' daughter is dying, and Jesus must come quick. This is a life and death situation we have in the gospel. So Jesus and Jairus are heading off, and they're walking as fast as they can to get to Jairus' daughter. The crowds are encircling. Everyone's trying to get to Jesus. So they're rushing there. Can you begin to imagine some of the chaos that's going on? And in the midst of all this chaos, our unnamed woman reaches out. In desperation, she reaches out to be healed. She doesn't want to be seen. She didn't want to interrupt Jesus on this really important business he was going on. Her anonymity is integral to her identity. She just needed her isolation to end. Luke tells us she comes up behind Jesus. She doesn't even touch Jesus himself, just the edge of his cloak. She isn't loud. She's not charismatic. She doesn't have a funny English accent. She isn't endearing in any way, and she is definitely not important like Jairus. She doesn't win over Jesus with her wit, her charm, or her status in society. She is simply trembling. She is alone, and she is afraid. And so, in this desperation and fear, she reaches out and breaks the rules. And what happens next, I think, is the most astounding. all of a sudden, in the midst of all this chaos, Jesus stops. Jesus, remember, is on really important business, and the clock is ticking. So why on earth does he bother stopping? It doesn't really make any sense. It's as if it's minutes before the Duke UNC game, and Jesus is frantically crossing the Duke campus in order to heal their star player, right? There is no time to stop, okay? Crowds are encircling, everyone's like, come on, Jesus, we gotta go full steam ahead. And all of a sudden, a UNC fan, not even a player, a fan, stops Jesus. Can you begin to imagine the outrage? I'm just joking, of course, but can you feel the urgency that's going on in this passage? Arguably, it would have been easier and way more practical for Jesus to continue on. It doesn't really make any sense why he stops. Surely Jesus, the Son of God, knew he had healed this woman, and she knew she had been healed. So why does he stop? Even the disciples are a bit like, come on, Jesus, what are you doing? Everyone's touching you. What are you doing? We've got to get to Jairus' daughter. But Jesus stops, he turns around, and he says, who touched me? When Jesus stops, in that moment, he invites our unnamed woman out of the darkness of her identity and into the light. He stops what he's doing in the midst of the chaos and the important business, and when she finally steps out, his response is, daughter. In that moment, Jesus renews and affirms her identity by seeing her the unnamed woman. In really seeing her, Jesus calls her beloved. In this moment, Jesus frees her from her socially imposed identity. He moves her from unnamed to named. He moves her from lost and ignored to found and part of the family. And he transforms her identity from shame to love and life. In order to do this, Jesus breaks both social and religious law. Remember, our woman could not be touched. In that act of seeing her, there was real transformative power. In that moment, Jesus invites her to step into her identity that was ordained for her all along as a daughter of the King. Where society saw broken, Jesus saw restored. Where religious leaders saw impure, Jesus saw clean. And when society refused to even look, Jesus stopped what he was doing, turned around, and named her beloved daughter. I love to read, and a couple of weeks ago, I read these words from the theologian Henry Nouwen. These words that I have just been unable to get out of my mind for weeks. Nouwen writes, self-rejection is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life because it contradicts the sacred voice that calls us beloved. Being the beloved expresses the core truth of our existence. Let me just repeat that. Nouwen writes, being the beloved expresses the core truth of our existence. If today I asked you the question, who are you? Would it even cross your mind to answer, beloved? I don't know how you came into church this morning. Maybe you were filled with dread when I ask you the question, who are you? Maybe you feel as unimportant as the bleeding woman. I wonder if you didn't write your prayer concern on the cross because you were worried about bothering Jesus with your less important struggle. I wonder if you've known the darkness so well it's become comforting. I wonder if you're more comfortable sitting in the shadows. I wonder if you don't know what it actually feels like to be called son or daughter. Friends, if that is you, today I come with good news. Luke shows us in this passage that we are beloved. It may just sound really simplistic to say that Jesus sees you, but for those of us who are sat in the mess and the darkness of this chaotic life, there is nothing simple about this. Jesus sees you and Jesus sees me, and there is nothing simple there. This is a transformative truth that transforms our identity. When the crowds ignore us because they're onto something too important and we can't see anything in ourselves to love, we are seen. Jesus calls both you and I beloved. But friends, it's not just that simple. Our call as Christians does not end at knowing our identity. It does not end with an answer to the question, who am I? Jesus died on the cross for you. He died on the cross for me, but ultimately, he died on the cross for all. The very fact that we know the core truth of our existence means we cannot keep that knowledge to ourselves. Jesus is not content to let our unnamed woman continue in the darkness of her isolation. He publicly addresses her, and in that moment when he stops and he turns around, he invites all of us to sit up and notice her too. I wonder how humanity would actually be transformed if we saw one another as beloved children of the King. I know some of you know this story already, but a couple of weeks ago, I was driving home from church when I was hit by a drunk driver. Thankfully, I'm all okay. But I was coming back from church. I had spent the day at Life Challenge in Silver. I had self-righteously thought I was engaged in the Lord's work. And I was so annoyed that someone had hit me. This inconsiderate person who was driving without a license, this inconsiderate person who was 4 times over the drunk driver limit. My friends who had lent me their car were now having to deal with all this insurance paperwork because of this inconsiderate person. I was angry. How could this person be so inconsiderate, I thought. And then a couple of days later, I received the police report. I learned of this man's name. I learned he was my age. And in that moment, I began to realize that this inconsiderate person in my mind had a story. They had a name. They had a family. They had a job. They had an identity. This person had spent the night in jail whilst I had been surrounded by love and comfort and support. In my rage and my self-righteousness, I failed to see the driver as beloved. I failed to really see him in that moment. I didn't have any empathy for any of the darkness or pain he might have been in. Following on from the accident, people asked me what they could pray for me. And I answered with 3 things. The first, I asked people to pray for my anxiety following the accident. I asked people to pray for my family friends whose car got totaled. And I asked people to pray for a speedy transition with the paperwork. Not once did I ask that anyone prayed for the other driver. Let me just repeat that so we can really get that. I asked people to pray for paperwork, and I did not ask people to pray for the other driver. In that moment, I failed to see that person with any empathy. I failed to see them. I failed to even see them, let's be honest. I failed to stop in the chaos of my life, turn around and see that person as beloved. A 2018 poll found that 54% of Americans feel as if nobody knows them well. 54%. I wonder how often we really see people. Who do we overlook when our lives are busy and we're maybe on the way to do something good like Jesus was? When we're having dinner at a restaurant before Bible study, and we're in a rush to get to church on time, and the restaurant is busy, do we really see the stressed waiting staff as beloved? Do we stop and see them? Or do we just see them as nameless, inconsiderate people who are slowing us down on our way to church? When reading the news before church, do we see the children who've been separated from their family at the border in their fear and desperation? Do we see them as beloved children? Or is it easier for us to turn off the TV, call them lawbreakers, and come to church before we miss the start of the service? When our friend is in pain and suffering in the midst of grief, do we see them in their hurt? Do we sit with them and listen and see them as beloved children? Or do we try and get them to stop complaining, tell them God's ways are higher, and tell them to look on the bright side? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying any of this is easy. I made those situations sound very simple, and I know life is a little bit more complicated than that. But let's remember, Jesus literally made himself unclean to see our unnamed woman. He didn't do what was right in the eyes of religion. He didn't do what was right in the eyes of society. He literally broke both social and religious law in order to stop and see this woman. In fact, it was so bad, he didn't even get to Jairus' daughter before she had died. He took so long stopping and seeing this woman. Can you begin to imagine the criticism Jesus took? Can you begin to imagine the criticism we might levy at Jesus? Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is proof of God's love for us. Jesus sees you and Jesus sees me in all of our brokenness and mess. We don't have to hide in the shadows. We, like the unnamed woman, can step into the knowledge that Jesus calls us beloved. When someone asks us the question, "Who are you?" we get to answer with beloved. But, and there's always a but, in order to step into this knowledge of Jesus' love for us and to really grapple with it, we also have to step into the knowledge that Jesus calls our worst enemies, our best friends, the saint, the sinner, the Democrat, the Republican, your family member who never does the dishes, the drunk driver, the immigrant, everyone Jesus calls beloved. Jesus takes you and Jesus takes me when we're nameless and in the dark, and he moves us named and loved into the light. He doesn't leave us in the shadows, but Jesus gives us the blueprint. And now, to fully grapple with our identity as the beloved, we must transform the question of who am I into the resounding declaration for all to hear, you are beloved.